Thank you Morning Brew for sponsoring today's video. I'm sure it comes as no surprise, but like many of you, I start my day off with a hot drink. Even so, I found I often got bogged down with the sheer amount of media coming at me, and the feeling that, although I was reading all morning, I was missing key stories. So lately, I've been grabbing another pick-me-up around lunchtime that resets my focus and allows me to get sped up on the latest business news. Morning Brew is a 5-minute shot of news items that are actually fun to read and are informative. For example, I got all the details of Elon Musk's conflict of interest trial in 3 short paragraphs, how he used Tesla to buy a startup, Solar City, founded by his cousins, and how he may have to personally cover the $2.6 billion cost of acquiring that company himself. Morning Brew is a US-based service, which means I get my newsletters around midday here in Europe. In the past, this was a time of day when I was often scrolling through news pretty aimlessly, and inevitably found myself getting distracted by random social media posts and other apps. With Morning Brew, I get informative and witty coverage of the news that is most relevant to me, and it doesn't waste my time. Even better, it's completely free and takes less than 15 seconds to subscribe. Click the link in the description below to subscribe to Morning Brew today. The era of King Bibi seems to have finally come to an end. Well, that may certainly be saying too much, because with Benjamin Netanyahu, the architect of modern Israel, you never know. Netanyahu has been central to everything in Israeli politics and has piloted the country longer than any other leader. He was prime minister from 1996 to 1999, and then again from 2009 to 2021. Not only that, Bibi, as he is affectionately known, also held 2 of Israel's 3 most important ministerial portfolios: foreign affairs between 2002 and 2003, and finance between 2003 and 2005. In other words, in one way or another, Netanyahu has dominated Israeli politics for almost 25 years. 25 long years, during which the country has undergone an enormous transformation. We're talking about things as significant as the economic takeoff that Israel has experienced in recent decades, its increasingly clear position of technological leadership on a global scale, and its openness to the world, including something that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. I am referring, of course, to the new diplomatic ties with the major Arab powers. But as the saying goes, every story comes to an end. In June 2021, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, replaced King Bibi as prime minister. His dismissal led, after an arduous journey, to the election of Naftali Bennett as the new leader of the Hebrew state. And all of this despite the fact that Bennett's party, Yamina, barely won 7 of the 120 member seats that make up the Knesset. So what is behind Netanyahu's farewell? More importantly, do you want to meet the new power figure of the Middle East and his more than diverse government? Well, in this video, we give you all the key details. So let's get started. It turns out that, in the elections on March 23rd, 2021, Benjamin Netanyahu's party, Likud, was once again the power that gained the most votes by far. Despite this, King Bibi did not manage to orchestrate a parliamentary majority in his favour. He came close, but he did not succeed. That's partly because of the accusations that have brought him before the courts. The fact is that Netanyahu is involved in 3 legal proceedings: Case 1000, Case 2000, and Case 4000. In the first, he is accused of fraud and breach of trust for allegedly receiving boxes of cigars and champagne from businessmen. In total, the assets are valued at around $198,000. Then there is Case 2000, in which he is accused of negotiating a deal with the owner of Israel's best-selling newspaper, Yediot Aharonot, for better coverage in exchange for regulatory benefits for the media outlet. And finally, there is Case 4000, in which Netanyahu is accused of granting regulatory favors to the country's leading telecommunications company, Bezeq Telecom Israel, in exchange for positive coverage on a website controlled by the former chairman of the telco. Netanyahu has therefore been charged with bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Those are the accusations that are on the table, regardless of whether Netanyahu is guilty or not. What is certain is that this litigation is something that has eroded his public image. And despite this, according to the polls, only 52% of Jewish Israelis and 56% of Arab Israelis were eager to see Bibi leave power. We are not talking about a large margin, and the fact that it was not a larger percentage shows us to what extent Israeli society was divided over its historic leader. In any case, the division of Israeli politics, the enormous parliamentary fragmentation, and Netanyahu's inability to achieve a new parliamentary majority was a scenario that Naftali Bennett took advantage of, like no other, to place himself at the helm of the country. Although, to be fair, it is far from clear how solid his new government will be.
Naftali Bennett becomes new Prime Minister as eight-party alliance topples Benjamin Netanyahu. Scroll.
And that explains why, a few weeks into his term of office, the problems began.
War in the Israeli parliament. Naftali Bennett loses his first battle to Netanyahu. The vote to extend a law that prevents the granting of Israeli citizenship to Palestinians who marry Israelis widens the cracks in the fragile executive. El Mundo.
But we'll talk about all of this later. The fact is that this leader, together with Yair Lapid of the central liberal Yesh Atid party, the party that received the second highest votes, managed to sell voters, above all, on two things. First, that after 4 elections between 2019 and 21, Israel had to avoid repeating parliamentary elections again at all costs. We are talking about 4 elections that had an estimated economic cost of $4.24 billion US. Yes, that's right. $4.24 billion in Uncle Sam's bills for a country of barely 9 million inhabitants. The reason for so much electoral celebration has to do with the fact that Israel is the only country in the world where the law obliges elections to be called if the parliament does not pass a new budget within a certain period of time. In this case, Netanyahu's insufficient majority caused the budgets to be postponed from 2018, which meant elections every year. Elections in Israel have a particularly high cost, not only because of the high security measures that are deployed to ensure the security of the elections, but also because Election Day is considered a holiday for workers, and any work activity has to be paid as overtime at 200% of the regular salary. And of course, since Netanyahu was not able to consolidate a clear majority in the first, second, or third, or even fourth instance, the message was clear. Secondly, the parties in opposition to Netanyahu saw in the judicial processes as a golden opportunity to get rid of King Bibi. For this reason, one of the strangest agreements in the political history of Israel was set in motion. A real mishmash of government made up of people who would hardly be caught dead with each other, or be trusted to spend time in the same space, without the risk of ending up in a police station. We're talking about 8 parties of all kinds of ideologies, and with a leader who barely won 7 deputies in the elections. But having said that, what is Naftali Bennett really like? What could Israel's new commander-in-chief mean for Israel and Middle Eastern policy? Well, let's take a look.
Bennett, the moderate radical.
Naftali Bennett. Keep that name in mind, because it may make a lot of headlines in the coming months. The new Israeli Prime Minister is anything but an ordinary politician. The son of US parents, Bennett is a former high-tech entrepreneur who sold his company, Toyota, for $145 million. But don't think that's all there is to him. Bennett, who as a young man had served in the Israeli Army's Special Corps and, despite being a millionaire, participated as a reservist in the Lebanon War in 2006, leading a unit of 67 Special Corps commandos, a battle after which Bennett was recruited as Chief of Staff by Netanyahu himself. It was his leap into politics. Since then, and before becoming Prime Minister, he has held 6 ministerial portfolios under Netanyahu's governments, among them 2 of the most important, economy and defense. Then, in terms of religion, he professes modern Orthodox Judaism, which is a branch of Judaism somewhat more fundamentalist than that followed by the current majority in Israel, but more secular and politically and socially moderate than the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox. And in fact, as a side note, Bennett has become the first Prime Minister to wear a kippah all the time. Yes, you know, the characteristic Jewish cap. But beyond personal issues, what matters most to us on VisualPolitik, logically, the leader's political positioning. And here, well, even Bennett described himself as more to the right of Netanyahu, both economically and socially. And although he has moved closer to power in Israel, he's become more and more conciliatory.
This whole notion of leftists being traitors and all of this nonsense is unacceptable. What Bibi did for ages, the dog whistle against this group or that group, I don't go there. I'm more right-wing than Bibi, but I don't use hate or polarization as a tool to promote myself politically. Naftali Bennett.
The truth is that the newspaper archives do not allow us to describe the new Israeli leader as moderate. For example, Bennett is a staunch opponent of the idea of two states, Palestinian and Israeli, as a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. So much so that he went so far as to say that it would be a national security suicide for Israel. Don't think that he said these things in a discreet way in a meeting behind closed doors, or far away from an open microphone. No way. He said it in 2014 to significant media outlets, such as the New York Times and CNN.
The old models of peace between Israel and the Palestinians are no longer relevant. The time has come to rethink the two-state solution. Naftali Bennett on the New York Times in 2014. The era of these negotiations is over. The approach that we've been trying for 20 years now clearly has reached its end. Naftali Bennett on CNN in 2014.
The problem is that by discarding the two-state solution, he is not arguing for the existence of a single state, but rather he is proposing to maintain Palestine as a kind of protectorate or permanent colony. A protectorate, of course, subordinated to Israel. And that, well, many would define that as a form of apartheid. In fact, Bennett also defends the military occupation of the West Bank because he says this territory was won by Israel during the Six-Day War. Of course, in no case does he propose to grant Israeli citizenship to the nearly 3 million inhabitants of this territory. In the same vein, he was Director General of the Yeshar Council, an organization that defends the interests of Israeli settlers in Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Because yes, the new Israeli Prime Minister supports settlements on Palestinian soil. But this is not the only issue where he is completely frank. In 2018, Bennett said that if he were Minister of Defense, he would implement a shoot-to-kill policy on the Gaza border against all those Palestinians who engaged in aggression against Israeli security forces. Moreover, when asked if this would include children, he answered very clearly. Check it out.
They are not children, they are terrorists. We are fooling ourselves. Naftali Bennett in 2018.
And beyond whether or not you agree, or whether or not many children are indeed indoctrinated and trained by Hamas to attack Israel, these kinds of messages reveal the new Prime Minister's not only hard, but staunchly hard line. However, territory and security policy are not the only items on his agenda. Just as Bennett is a clear example of a nationalist politician, he is also a devoted advocate of free markets, low taxes, deregulation, and the reduction of union power and privileges. For now, in the draft of the state budget for Israel that was agreed on with the 8-party coalition that has brought him to power, a tax freeze for 2022 was expressly included. Likewise, in matters of social rights, despite his status as a modern orthodox, he is relatively open-minded. For example, he advocates that LGBT people have the same rights as any heterosexual person. In other words, Israel has a new prime minister with a pro-business agenda, experience in private and public management, a long career as an officer in the Army Special Corps, including real combat experience, and a strong nationalist emphasis. In short, it's as he defined himself. Politically, we talk about Bennett being to the right of Netanyahu, specifically to the nationalist right. But just because he is prime minister does not mean that he will have free reign. Bennett heads one of the most diverse governments we could imagine, a Frankenstein government. And why do I say this? Well, listen up.
A Frankenstein government.
Nationalist right, national liberalism, liberal centre, Zionist social democrats, green left, Islamists, 8 parties, and coalitions that literally come from all over the political spectrum. This random mix is what makes up the new Israeli government, composed of 28 ministries, a number of ministries that may seem huge to you, until we take into account that the last Netanyahu government had 36. Yes, that's Israeli politics. Everyone has to get their share of the pie. In addition, the government will have 2 different terms. For the first 2 years, Bennett will be the prime minister, and for the remaining 2 years, Yair Lapid of the liberal and secular centrist Yesh Atid party will be the prime minister, if they manage to get that far. We're talking about a huge shambles that was set in motion with a single objective: to throw King Bibi out of power. The question is, will this work out? Well, the truth is that many analysts and experts in Israel and Middle Eastern politics, if not most, believe that this government won't last 5 minutes, and that Lapid will not become prime minister, at least not with the current coalition. And of course, the very broad and contrary ideological spectrum of the parties that comprise it make it very difficult to reach consensus, especially when the going gets tough. I'm thinking, for example, of another escalation of violence with Hamas in Gaza. Without looking too far, in this new government, there is an Israeli Arab from the Ra'am party, of Islamist ideology, as Deputy Minister of Arab Affairs. We're talking about Mansour Abbas. It is difficult to imagine him supporting from within the government a military escalation with Gaza, greater control in the West Bank, or a forceful response in the event that Hamas decides to return to its old ways with rockets or terrorist attacks. But not only that, among Abbas's political objectives within the Israeli government is to increase, and greatly, government spending on Arab towns and villages in Israel, something that doesn't seem very compatible with Bennett's advocacy of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. In other words, the biggest challenge for the new Israeli government, above anything else related to politics, defense, or economics, is its own existence, to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, as much as Bennett himself says that he prefers to put aside differences.
Our principle is, we will sit together and we will forge forward on what we agree, and there is much to agree upon, transport, education, and so on, and what separates us, we will leave to the side. Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister of Israel.
The clashes will come. This government has not been formed here with a political project, but with a single mission: to throw Bibi out of power. And to top it off, we're not talking about a coalition with a very large majority either. We're talking about 61 MPs against 59 who support Netanyahu. In a nutshell, these are the characteristics of the new government and the new commander-in-chief of Israel's policy and defense. On VisualPolitik, we will follow the situation closely, and we will tell you all the news, both in new videos and in our exclusive bulletin for the Patreon community. To receive it, you just have to join VisualPolitik's Patreon program. We'll leave you all the details in the description. But at this point, it's your turn. What do you think of the anti-Netanyahu bloc's move to oust Bibi from power? Does this coalition have a future, or will it end up a chaotic mess? Do you think that Israel will be in better hands now that you know the new Prime Minister and his new government? As always, we love to hear your opinion, so do leave your comments below. And if you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Best regards. I'll see you next time.